May 1943, Downsview, Ontario, 0640 hours. The smell of spruce resin and cassane glue hung thick in the air of what had been, 18 months earlier, a furniture factory. Now it was something else entirely. Inside Building 7, under harsh work lamps that cast long shadows across plywood ribs and wooden formers, Canadian engineers and carpenters assembled what the British Air Ministry had called a fool's errand. A bomber made of wood, not as a prototype, not as an experiment, as a weapon of war. Geoffrey de Havilland Junior stood at the edge of the assembly floor, blueprints rolled under one arm, coffee cooling in a chipped enamel mug. He was 30 years old. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of months without proper sleep. His father, the legendary aircraft designer Geoffrey de Havilland Senior, had conceived the idea in England 2 years prior, but it was here, in Canada, that the dream would either prove itself or collapse under the weight of its own audacity. The Mosquito. That was the name. Fast, annoying, impossible to swat. It had to be. Across the Atlantic, the war was eating men and machines at a rate no one had predicted. Heavy bombers, the Lancaster, the Halifax, lumbered through German airspace like floating coffins. Flak tore through aluminum fuselages. Messerschmitt fighters shredded tail sections. Crews died by the thousands. The solution, according to conventional wisdom, was more armor, more guns, more weight. De Havilland had proposed the opposite. Strip it all away. Make it so fast that nothing could catch it. Build it from wood because metal was running out and because wood, properly laminated and shaped, could be stronger than anyone imagined. The Air Ministry had laughed. Then they had argued. Then reluctantly they had agreed to a trial run. But England's factories were stretched to breaking. So the work came to Canada, to a nation of loggers and carpenters who knew timber like soldiers knew rifles, to Downsview, where de Havilland Canada had been assembling tiger moths for training pilots. Now they would build something no one had ever seen. The fuselage of the Mosquito was a shell of balsa wood, sandwiched between layers of birch plywood, bonded with glue made from milk protein. It sounded absurd. It sounded desperate. It was both. But when the pieces cured in the hot presses, the result was a structure lighter than aluminum and nearly as strong. The wings were spruce, laminated in multiple layers, shaped over wooden molds with a precision that rivaled any metal press. Every joint, every seam, every curve had to be perfect. Wood did not forgive errors the way metal did. A crack, a gap, a misalignment, and the entire airframe could fail at altitude. De Havilland walked the line slowly, inspecting each station. At Station 3, 2 carpenters were fitting a wing spar into place, their hands moving with the kind of confidence that came from decades of woodworking. One of them, a man named Emil Kurtz, had built church pews before the war. Now he built bombers. He did not speak much, neither did de Havilland. There was nothing to say that the work itself did not already communicate. Outside, the sun was rising over the flat Ontario landscape. Inside, under artificial light, the Mosquito was taking shape. Fuselage after fuselage, wing after wing. The factory ran 2 shifts, then 3. Women joined the line, their hands smaller and steadier for the delicate gluing work. Teenagers fresh out of school learned to read blueprints and shape wood with files and sanding blocks. The pace was relentless. Every day, another aircraft closer to completion. Every night, reports came in from England. Bomber losses, fighter losses. The Luftwaffe was evolving. Faster planes, better tactics. And now, rumors of something new, something terrifying. Jet engines. The intelligence reports were fragmentary, classified, and deeply troubling. German engineers had cracked a problem that had eluded everyone else. They had built fighters powered not by propellers, but by turbines that sucked in air, compressed it, ignited it, and spat it out as thrust. The Messerschmitt 262. Speeds approaching 900 kilometers per hour. Faster than anything the Allies had, faster perhaps than anything they could build. De Havilland read the reports in his cramped office on the 2nd floor of the factory. His hand holding the page did not shake, but his jaw tightened. The Mosquito in its current configuration could reach 650 kilometers per hour in level flight. Fast for a bomber, faster than most fighters, but not fast enough. Not if the Germans deployed their jets in numbers. not if the war turned into a race between propellers and turbines. He set the report down and looked out the window at the assembly floor below. Wooden bombers. The phrase still sounded ridiculous, even to him, but the numbers did not lie. The Mosquito was light, it was nimble, it could climb faster and turn tighter than any heavy bomber, and it could carry a respectable bomb load, 2,000 pounds, deep into enemy territory. More importantly, it could do something no other bomber could. It could survive. The first Canadian-built Mosquito rolled out of Downsview in September 1942. It was painted in standard RAF camouflage, dark green and grey, with roundels on the wings and fuselage. It looked to the untrained eye like any other aircraft. But when the test pilot, a quiet man named Pat Fillingham, took it up for the first time, he came back with a grin that no one who saw it would forget. "It flies like a fighter," he said. "It flies like nothing else." The test flights continued. Speed trials, dive trials, endurance runs over Lake Ontario. The Mosquito performed beyond expectations. It was stable, it was responsive, it did not vibrate or shudder the way heavy bombers did. The wooden structure absorbed stress in ways metal could not, and it was fast. Faster than the Spitfire in some configurations, faster than anything the Germans had in the air, except possibly the jet. By early 1943, the factory was producing 4 Mosquitoes a week, then 6, then 8. The aircraft were crated, loaded onto ships, and sent across the Atlantic to England, where they were assembled and handed over to RAF squadrons. The first combat sorties were flown in May, daylight raids deep into occupied Europe with no fighter escort. The crews were told to rely on speed and altitude. Do not dogfight. Do not slow down. Get in, drop the bombs, get out. They came back. Not all of them, but more than anyone expected. The Mosquito was proving itself, but the war was not slowing down. Neither were the Germans. In his office late at night, de Havilland stared at the production schedules and the intelligence summaries. The Luftwaffe was testing the Tu-62 in combat. Limited deployments, but effective. Allied pilots reported aircraft that appeared out of nowhere, struck, and vanished before anyone could react. The jet age was beginning, whether anyone was ready or not. The question was simple. Could a wooden bomber built in a furniture factory in Ontario outrun the future? De Havilland did not know, but he intended to find out. November 1943, RAF Marham, Norfolk, England. 230 hours. The airfield was dark, lit only by hooded lamps and the faint glow of instrument panels in the cockpit of a Mosquito Mark IV. Flight Lieutenant James Rowland, a Canadian from Winnipeg, sat in the left seat running through the pre-flight checklist for the 3rd time. Beside him, Navigator Flying Officer Thomas Baines tapped a pencil against his knee pad, calculating fuel loads and target coordinates. Outside, the ground crew finished topping off the tanks and stepped back into the shadows. The engines coughed, caught, and settled into a smooth, powerful hum. 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same power plants that drove the Spitfire. But here they were, mated to an airframe that weighed half as much. The mission was simple in theory. Fly to Berlin, drop a 4,000-pound cookie, a cylindrical high-explosive bomb, on a railway marshalling yard. Return before dawn. No escort, no gunners, just speed and altitude. Rowland had flown 11 missions in Lancasters before transferring to Mosquito squadrons. He knew what it felt like to lumber through flak, to hear the metal skin of a heavy bomber creak and tear under fire. The Mosquito was different. It did not feel like a bomber. It felt like something alive. He pushed the throttles forward. The Mosquito accelerated down the runway, wheels lifting smoothly after less than 400 meters. The climb was steep, nearly vertical compared to the heavy bombers. At 3,000 meters, they leveled off and turned east toward the North Sea. The night was clear. Stars overhead, cloud banks below. The aircraft slipped through the darkness like a shadow. Back in Canada, production had ramped up. The Downsview factory was now producing 12 Mosquitoes a week. A second facility had opened in Calgary. Workers who had never built anything more complex than furniture were now shaping wings and fuselages with micrometer precision. The wood came from British Columbia, spruce and birch, kiln dried and graded for strength. The glue came from Ontario dairies, casein extracted from milk, and mixed with formaldehyde to create a bond that could withstand temperature extremes and vibration. Every component was tested, weighed, and logged. There was no room for error. Geoffrey de Havilland had returned to England in late 1942, leaving the Canadian operation in the hands of his production managers. His focus now was on variants. The Mosquito was not just a bomber, it was a platform. Engineers in Hatfield were adapting it into a night fighter, a reconnaissance aircraft, a pathfinder, even an anti-shipping strike plane. Each role required modifications, but the core design remained the same: fast, light, wooden. The breakthrough had come not from a single innovation, but from a refusal to compromise. When the Air Ministry demanded gun turrets, de Havilland refused. Turrets added weight and drag. They made the aircraft slower and less maneuverable. The Mosquito's defense was speed. That was the entire philosophy. If you could not be caught, you could not be shot down. The numbers were beginning to prove him right. Loss rates for Mosquito squadrons were a fraction of those for heavy bombers. Crews were returning. Missions were succeeding. But the Luftwaffe was adapting. By the autumn of 1943, German radar networks had improved. Night fighters were being vectored more accurately toward incoming bombers, and the Me-262, still in limited deployment, was appearing more frequently in combat reports. Allied intelligence estimated that Germany would have operational jet squadrons by mid-1944. When that happened, the air war would change fundamentally. Roland and Baines crossed the coast of occupied Holland at 00:15 hours. Below, searchlights stabbed upward through the clouds, sweeping back and forth in coordinated patterns. Flak bursts dotted the sky, orange flowers blooming and fading in seconds. The Mosquito climbed to 6,000 meters, above the effective range of most anti-aircraft guns. At this altitude, the cold was brutal. Ice formed on the windscreen. Breath frosted on instruments. Baines called out course corrections, his voice steady through the intercom. Roland made small adjustments to heading, watching the engine temperatures and fuel gauges. Everything was running smoothly. In Canada, the engineers were working on a problem. The Mosquito was fast, but it could be faster. Wind tunnel tests at the National Research Council in Ottawa had identified areas of drag. The engine cowlings were not optimized. The wing root fairings created turbulence. Small changes, but at high speed, small changes mattered. A team led by a young aerodynamicist named Margaret Tully redesigned the cowlings, smoothing the airflow and reducing drag by nearly 8%. The modification added 15 kilometers per hour to the top speed. It did not sound like much. In a race against a jet, it could mean survival. Tully was one of dozens of women who had joined the war effort in technical roles. She had studied mathematics at the University of Toronto and joined the NRC in 1941. Her work was precise, methodical, and relentless. She did not think of herself as breaking barriers. She thought of herself as solving problems. The Mosquito had problems. She solved them. The aircraft continued east. At 01:45 hours, they crossed into German airspace. The searchlights intensified. Flak bursts came closer, close enough that Roland could feel the concussion through the airframe. He pushed the throttles to maximum continuous power and climbed to 7,000 meters. The Merlins roared, consuming fuel at a rate that left little margin for error. Baines recalculated their range. They would have enough to reach Berlin and return, but only just. At 02:10 hours, the city appeared on the horizon, a faint glow, backlit by fires from previous raids. Berlin had been hit repeatedly over the past year, but it was still functioning, still producing weapons, still coordinating the German war machine. Roland descended to 5,000 meters, the altitude for bomb release. The aircraft bucked slightly as it passed through turbulence. Baines counted down the final approach. 10 seconds. 5. Release. The bomb bay doors opened. The 4,000-pound cookie tumbled out, falling silently through the night. The Mosquito, suddenly lighter, leapt upward. Roland banked hard to the left, turning west, climbing again. Behind them, seconds later, the bomb detonated. A flash that lit the clouds from below. A shockwave that rippled outward. They did not wait to observe the results. Speed was survival. The return flight was uneventful until they reached the Dutch coast. That was when the night fighter appeared. It came from above and behind, a Messerschmitt 110, radar-equipped and deadly. The German pilot had been tracking them for minutes, waiting for the right moment. He opened fire at 800 meters, a burst of cannon shells that stitched across the Mosquito's left wing. The wooden structure absorbed the impacts, but one shell punched through the aileron control. Roland felt the aircraft shudder and pull to the left. He corrected with rudder and throttle, pushing the Merlins beyond their rated limits. The Mosquito accelerated. The Messerschmitt tried to follow, but it was heavier, slower. Within seconds, the distance opened. 1 kilometer, 2. The German pilot fired again, but the range was too great. The Mosquito disappeared into the darkness. Roland brought the damaged aircraft back to Marham at 04:20 hours, landing with one aileron partially disabled. The ground crew counted 23 holes in the airframe. None had penetrated the fuel tanks. None had struck the engines. The wooden structure, laminated and bonded, had flexed under the impacts and held. A metal fuselage would have torn. The Mosquito had saved their lives. By December 1943, more than 200 Mosquitoes were in operational service with the RAF and RCAF. They flew daily missions over occupied Europe, striking targets that heavy bombers could not reach without unacceptable losses. They photographed enemy installations, flying faster and higher than interceptors could follow. They marked targets for the main bomber streams, dropping flares and incendiaries with pinpoint accuracy. And they were getting faster. The modifications from the NRC were incorporated into new production aircraft. Engines were tuned for higher output. Propeller blades were reshaped for better thrust. The Mosquito Mark 16, scheduled to enter service in early 1944, would be capable of nearly 700 kilometers per hour in level flight. It would be the fastest operational bomber in the world. But the Messerschmitt 262 could fly at 900. Geoffrey de Havilland knew the numbers. He also knew that speed alone would not win the war. The Mosquito had to be more than fast. It had to be everywhere. It had to operate in conditions that would ground other aircraft. It had to carry bombs, cameras, and reconnaissance equipment deep into enemy territory, and return every time. It had to be, in every sense, indispensable. In the winter of 1943, that was exactly what it was becoming. But the question remained. When the jets came in force, would wood and speed be enough? April 1945, Lüneburg Heath, Germany, 15-20 hours. The war in Europe was collapsing. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. American and British armies were pushing across the Rhine. The Luftwaffe, once the most formidable air force in the world, was reduced to scattered remnants, flying from improvised airstrips with dwindling fuel and ammunition. But it was not finished. In the final weeks of the war, the Messerschmitt 262 jets were flying combat missions with a desperation that made them more dangerous than ever. They had nothing to lose. Squadron leader William McKnight, a Canadian from Regina, Saskatchewan, sat in the cockpit of his Mosquito Mark 30, engines idling on a forward airfield in Holland. His aircraft was one of the latest variants, fitted with uprated Merlins producing 1,700 horsepower each. Top speed, 715 kilometers per hour. It was fast enough to outrun almost anything. Almost. The mission briefing had been direct. German jet fighters were operating from an airfield near Hamburg. Intelligence indicated that a squadron of 262s was being prepared for a final strike against Allied bomber formations. McKnight's task was reconnaissance. Photograph the airfield, assess the number of operational jets, return with actionable intelligence. Do not engage. The Mosquito carried no bombs, only cameras mounted in the nose and belly. It was a pure speed run. He advanced the throttles and lifted off, climbing steeply into a grey spring sky. Beside him, Navigator Flight Lieutenant David Corrigan checked the map coordinates and set the course. They would approach the target from the west, flying at 7,000 meters, high enough to avoid most flak but low enough for clear photographs. The flight time was 38 minutes. Back in Canada, the war effort had shifted. The factories in Downsview and Calgary were still producing Mosquitoes, but the pace had slowed. Victory in Europe was imminent. Production would soon be redirected toward the Pacific Theater, where the Mosquito's speed and range made it ideal for long-distance strikes against Japanese targets. Engineers were already working on tropical variants, aircraft modified to operate in high heat and humidity, with upgraded cooling systems and corrosion-resistant finishes. Geoffrey de Havilland, now in his early 50s, had returned to Canada in March 1945 to oversee the transition. He walked the factory floors, inspecting the same workstations he had stood beside 3 years earlier. The workers were older now. Some of them had sons or husbands who had flown Mosquitoes in combat. The aircraft they built were no longer experimental. They were proven. They had flown more than 30,000 combat sorties. They had dropped thousands of tons of bombs. They had photographed every major target in occupied Europe, and they had done it with loss rates lower than any other bomber type in the war. The numbers told the story. Heavy bombers, Lancasters and Halifaxes suffered loss rates averaging 5% per mission. Over a 30-mission tour, a crew had less than a 20% chance of survival. Mosquito squadrons, by contrast, lost less than 2% per mission. Crews completed full tours and flew second tours. Some flew third tours. The wooden bomber, the aircraft that had been dismissed as a desperate gamble, had become the safest bomber in the sky. But the final test was still ahead. McKnight and Corrigan crossed into German airspace at 15:45 hours. The landscape below was scarred and broken. Bomb craters, burned-out villages, rivers choked with debris. The war had passed through here like a storm, leaving nothing intact. Ahead, the city of Hamburg was a grey smudge on the horizon. McKnight descended to 6,000 meters and throttled back slightly, allowing Corrigan to activate the camera systems. The Mosquito leveled off, flying smooth and straight. The airfield appeared below them. A single concrete runway, partially cratered but still operational. Along the edges, dispersed under camouflage netting, were the unmistakable shapes of Messerschmitt 262s. McKnight counted 8, possibly more hidden under cover. Some appeared damaged, others looked ready to fly. The cameras clicked and whirred, capturing frame after frame. Then the flak started. It came from emplacements McKnight had not seen, concealed in the tree line around the airfield. Heavy caliber, 88mm shells, detonating in clusters at exactly their altitude. The Mosquito shuddered as shrapnel tore through the air. McKnight pushed the throttles to full power and banked hard to the left, diving to pick up speed. Corrigan braced against the instrument panel as the aircraft pulled 4 times the force of gravity. The flak followed them, bursting closer with each salvo. And then, rising from the runway below, a Messerschmitt 262. It climbed vertically, engines screaming, a column of blue-white flame trailing from its twin turbines. The acceleration was unnatural, physics defying. Within seconds it was at their altitude. Within 10 seconds it was behind them. The German pilot opened fire at 600 meters, 30mm cannon shells, each one capable of tearing a wing off. McKnight did not try to turn. He pushed the Mosquito into a shallow dive, trading altitude for speed. The Merlins howled at maximum power, propellers biting into the thin air. 700 kilometers per hour, 720, 730. The wooden airframe vibrated but held. The 262 followed, closing the distance. 500 meters. 400. Then something changed. The jet began to fall behind, not quickly but perceptibly. The Mosquito, already at its maximum speed, was holding steady. The 262, heavy and fuel-hungry, could not sustain the pursuit at low altitude. Its engines, designed for high-altitude performance, were less efficient in the dense air below 4,000 meters. The German pilot fired one more burst, but the range was too great. The shells passed behind the Mosquito's tail. Within 30 seconds, the jet had broken off, climbing back toward its base. McKnight leveled off at 2,000 meters and turned west. His hands were shaking. Corrigan was silent, staring at the fuel gauges. They had burned through nearly a quarter of their total fuel in 3 minutes of maximum power. But they were alive, and they had the photographs. The intelligence from that mission confirmed what Allied commanders had suspected. The Luftwaffe's jet program, though technologically advanced, was crippled by fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and a lack of trained pilots. The 262 was faster than anything the Allies had, but it could not be everywhere. It could not operate at low altitude. And it could not, as McKnight had just proven, catch a Mosquito that was already at speed. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. The Mosquito had flown its last combat mission over Germany on May 7th, the day before the official surrender. In total, Canadian factories had produced more than 1,100 Mosquitoes. They had served in every theatre of the war. They had outlasted the jets, outlasted the heavy bombers, and outlasted the skeptics who said wooden aircraft had no place in modern warfare. Geoffrey de Havilland stood in the Downsview factory on the morning of May 8th, listening to the radio broadcast of the German surrender. Around him, workers were silent, absorbing the news. 3 years of relentless production. 3 years of 12-hour shifts and impossible deadlines. It was over, but the aircraft they had built would fly for decades more. Mosquitoes remained in service with the Royal Canadian Air Force until 1951, used for reconnaissance and training. Some were converted into civilian transports. A few were preserved in museums, their wooden frames still intact, still strong. The design itself influenced every fast bomber that followed. The concept of speed over armour, the idea that a well-designed airframe could survive by not being where the enemy expected. In the end, the Mosquito had not outrun the future. It had redefined it. The jet age came, as everyone knew it would, but the lessons of the wooden bomber, built in a furniture factory by carpenters and engineers who refused to accept conventional wisdom, remained. War is not won by the strongest weapon. It is won by the weapon that arrives when and where it is needed. The weapon that adapts. The weapon that survives. William McKnight returned to Canada in June 1945 and never spoke publicly about the mission over Hamburg. He did not need to. The photographs were enough. They showed an airfield, a handful of jets, and the final moments of a technological dream that had come too late. The Mosquito, made of spruce and birch and glue, had outlasted them all. In the decades that followed, aviation engineers studied the Mosquito's design, searching for the secret of its success. They found no single innovation, no revolutionary breakthrough. What they found was a philosophy. Build light, build fast, trust the material, trust the people who shape it, and never ever assume that the impossible is truly impossible. The wooden bomber had proven that, and in doing so, it had changed everything.